History has a pattern, not a clean one, not an obvious one, but a pattern all the same. Across generations, across continents, across belief systems and political lines, men who stood up, truly stood up, have a habit of disappearing far too early, not fading away, not retiring peacefully, but being taken, removed, silenced, their voices cut off just as they began to resonate beyond their immediate surroundings. It doesn't make sense. And maybe that's what makes it so unsettling. Welcome to Whispers of the Taken. Tonight, we're doing something different. This isn't just a story about death. It's about silence, about kings whose voices were taken far too soon, not because they were weak, but because they were powerful. Men who spoke truth, built movements, and changed lives, until someone decided they had to be stopped. This is not history as you were taught it. This is what happens when leadership becomes dangerous. When we look back at figures like Martin Luther King Jr., we don't just see a man with a dream. We see a man who slowly became a threat to the comfort of an entire system. King didn't call for chaos. He didn't call for bloodshed or revenge. He called for conscience. And history has shown us time and time again that conscience is dangerous because it forces people to look at what they've been taught to ignore. In the final years of his life, King's message was changing. It was no longer confined to civil rights alone. He spoke openly about economic injustice, about poverty as a weapon, about war as a business, about how poor people, black, white, and brown, were being pitted against one another while power consolidated quietly at the top. He was no longer just asking America to integrate, he was asking it to reconsider itself. And then suddenly, he was gone. Official explanations exist. They always do. But questions remain, not because people crave mystery, but because patterns demand attention. That same pattern appears again in the life of Malcolm X. Malcolm's story is often simplified, reduced to anger, sharp words, and confrontation. But what is rarely emphasized is his transformation. In his final year, Malcolm was evolving rapidly. He traveled, he listened. He began to see the struggle not as race versus race, but as oppression versus power. He spoke about global unity, self-determination, and liberation beyond borders. He was growing beyond labels, beyond organizations, beyond anyone's control. And that evolution made him unpredictable. Malcolm was killed just as his message was broadening, just as his influence was deepening. Two men, different voices, different methods, same ending. Then there was Fred Hampton, a name many people still don't learn until adulthood. Fred Hampton was only 21 years old, yet he was doing something profoundly dangerous. He was uniting people, not symbolically, not rhetorically, but materially, across racial and economic lines. He believed that poor people, regardless of color, had more in common with each other than with those who benefited from their division. That belief alone was enough to place a target on his back. Fred Hampton was unalived in his sleep. No speech, no debate, no chance to finish what he started. And the pattern didn't end in the past. Decades later, voices of influence emerged through culture rather than politics. Voices like Tupac Shakur. Tupac spoke openly about surveillance, manipulation, and systemic control. He warned about how anger is shaped and aimed, how communities are destabilized from within, how truth is often dismissed as paranoia until it's too late. He was killed at 25. And more recently, Nipsey Hussle. Nipsey wasn't just speaking, he was building. Ownership, education, long-term thinking. He encouraged people to invest, to learn, to plan for generations rather than moments. He wasn't asking for attention. He was creating infrastructure. And he was killed in the very place he built to uplift others. Different eras, different platforms. Same result. Men who refused to stay quiet. Men who challenged narratives. Men who reminded people of their power. And men who were taken before their work was done. The cost of leadership. Leadership, real leadership, has never been safe. Not the kind that smiles for cameras or follows scripts, but the kind that challenges people to see the world as it truly is. True leaders don't just represent change, They invite it, and that invitation has consequences. Medgar Evers understood this well. Evers wasn't a firebrand. He wasn't shouting into crowds or commanding stages. He worked quietly, methodically, pushing for voting rights, equal access, and basic dignity in a place where even asking for those things was dangerous. He organized. He documented injustice. He refused to back down. And one night, as he returned home to his family, Medgar Evers was shot in his own driveway. History framed it as an isolated act, a lone crime, an unfortunate moment. But leadership like his rarely ends by accident. The same cost followed Robert F. Kennedy. Robert Kennedy began his public life inside the system. But over time, something changed. He spoke openly about poverty, about racial injustice, about ending war rather than prolonging it. He connected with people not as statistics, but as human beings. He made the powerful uncomfortable by listening to the powerless. And as his influence grew, as his message began to resonate across lines of race and class, he too was taken, shot moments after speaking words of hope. Leadership like that doesn't fade quietly, it's interrupted. Even outside politics, the pattern persists. Thomas Sankara was elected, but what made him dangerous was how he led. Not through luxury, not through distance, but through example. He rejected excess, cut his own salary, sold government limousines, chose simplicity in a world where power usually hides behind wealth. Sankara spoke of self-reliance over dependency, dignity over aid, education over exploitation. A future built by the people, not borrowed from outside forces. He didn't just tell his nation they were capable. He demanded they believe it themselves. Under his leadership, children were vaccinated, women were elevated, land was reclaimed, and a country was told it could stand on its own feet. That message traveled far beyond borders. And that may have been the problem. Thomas Sankara was killed at just 37 years old, removed before his vision could fully take root. History often explains this away as political instability, as internal conflict, as an unfortunate but inevitable outcome of leadership. But history also has a habit of dulling the blade, of smoothing over uncomfortable truths so we don't have to ask who benefits when voices like his are silenced. Because once we accept that leadership carries a cost, the question is no longer whether there is a price, but who keeps collecting the payment. Culture as a threat. It isn't only politicians or activists who face this fate. Sometimes the most powerful voices come wrapped in rhythm and rhyme. Culture has always been dangerous because it reaches people before permission is granted. The notorious B.I.G. wasn't just a rapper, he was a storyteller, a mirror held up to reality. Through his music, Biggie documented survival, ambition, fear, and consequence. He didn't sanitize the struggle, he narrated it honestly, vividly, and without apology. His voice carried beyond New York, beyond genre, beyond the streets that shaped him. And with that reach came influence. Biggie was on the verge of transition, moving beyond raw survival stories and into legacy, business, longevity, a future that suggested he wouldn't be confined to a single chapter. He was beginning to outgrow the role history assigned him, and then he was taken from us. The official story tells us it was chaos, that it was random, that it was simply violence colliding with fame. But randomness doesn't explain resonance, and resonance has always unsettled those who benefit from silence. The same uneasy questions follow Tupac Shakur. Tupac's music went far beyond entertainment. He spoke openly about systemic neglect, surveillance, and psychological pressure placed on entire communities. He gave language to emotions people were told to suppress. Decades later, his words still feel current, still uncomfortable, still alive. That kind of timelessness is rare, and history has shown us what endures has a way of making power nervous. The pattern no one wants to talk about. When you line these stories up side by side, something unsettling begins to take shape. Not a theory, not a single event, but a pattern that refuses to disappear. These men weren't perfect. They weren't saints. They weren't free of contradiction or flaw, but they were effective. They reached people where institutions couldn't. They spoke in ways that felt human instead of scripted. They made change feel possible, not theoretical. And that may be the most dangerous thing of all, because history shows us, again and again, that the moment belief spreads beyond isolated individuals, something shifts. When hope stops being private and becomes collective, when people stop waiting and start imagining together, intervention often follows. Not always loudly, not always visibly, but decisively. What's rarely discussed is that power doesn't fear anger nearly as much as it fears unity. Anger can be redirected, outrage can be exhausted, but belief, shared belief, has momentum. There's a scene in A Bug's Life, a children's movie of all things, that explains this more clearly than many history books ever have. The villain doesn't scream, he doesn't threaten, he explains. If one stands up, others will follow. If others follow, the system collapses. It's presented simply, almost casually, as if it's an obvious truth everyone already understands. And maybe that's what makes it so disturbing. Because wrapped inside animation meant for children is a lesson adults are taught to ignore. That systems survive not because they are strong, but because people believe they are alone. Once that illusion breaks, once individuals realize they are not isolated, not powerless, not alone, everything changes. And history suggests that moment is rarely allowed to fully arrive, not because it's impossible, but because it's effective. Why this hurts me personally so much? The reason this hurts so much, and I'm speaking for myself here, is because history keeps teaching the same brutal lesson. The men who genuinely stand for something, who challenge power, who try to lift people instead of control them, are taken from us far too damn soon. They leave behind holes that never fully heal, in our communities, in our movements, in our hearts. And what makes that pain turn into something heavier, something closer to anger, is watching who is allowed to remain. Watching how, in my opinion, the system somehow finds room to protect monsters while silencing leaders. Because while men like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and others were cut down in the prime of their purpose, the government somehow allowed someone like Jeffrey Epstein to operate for years, openly, repeatedly, committing unspeakable acts against vulnerable people. Acts that many believe were known, acts that many believe were hidden. It has been years since Epstein allegedly took his own life, and yet the so-called Epstein files, the names, the connections, the accountability, have still not been fully released. We're told they implicate some of the most powerful people in the world: politicians, former presidents, global elites, even members of a royal family from another country. And that's the part that's impossible to wrap your mind around. How do the men trying to heal society die young, while those accused of exploiting it are protected, delayed, buried behind sealed documents and quiet explanations? What makes this so deeply heartbreaking isn't just the loss of life. It's the loss of futures that never had the chance to unfold. It's the unanswered questions that follow every name. What would the world look like if Martin Luther King Jr. had lived long enough to see the digital age? If he had witnessed how voices now travel instantly across borders, how movements can rise overnight instead of over decades? Would he have used technology to unite us further, or warned us about how easily it could be weaponized to divide us? What if Malcolm X had been allowed to continue his evolution? If his global awareness, his calls for sovereignty and dignity, had been given time to fully mature? How different would conversations about power, identity, and liberation sound today? And what if Nipsey Hussle had been given decades instead of years? If his blueprint, ownership over dependency, patience over desperation, had spread city by city, generation by generation? How many lives might have changed course before they ever reached hopelessness? These questions don't haunt us because they're dramatic. They haunt us because they're reasonable. We don't mourn these men only because they died. We mourn them because they were leading us somewhere. They were pointing forward, towards something unfinished. They carried momentum, and momentum is fragile. Leadership like that is rare, not because people don't want to lead, but because few are willing to carry the weight that comes with it, the scrutiny, the resistance, the danger. And when leaders like these are taken early, the damage doesn't stop with their deaths. It spreads. Movements stall, conversations quiet, hope hesitates. That's why this hurts so much. Because what was stolen wasn't just a life, it was direction. And watching a world where that kind of leadership is erased, while corruption seems endlessly protected, is enough to break something inside you. The silence that follows. After each death, there is mourning. Candles are lit, speeches are delivered, anniversaries are marked, photographs are shared, stories are retold. But beneath all of that, there is also silence. Silence where action should have been. Silence where momentum once surged. Silence that quietly reshapes the world the way it always did. Slightly slower, slightly colder, slightly less hopeful. If you're enjoying the video so far, please take a second to like and subscribe. It's a huge help to the channel. Thank you. Now back to the story. Movements fracture. Ideas stall. Plans that could have changed lives are abandoned halfway. Fear creeps in like a shadow stretching over everything. Because when people see what happens to those who dared to stand, when they witness influence turned into threat, when they feel the cost of courage firsthand, many choose to sit down. And maybe that is the most tragic outcome of all. Not the death itself, not even the violence that ended a life, but the hesitation it leaves behind. The quiet that settles over hearts, over communities, over movements. The invisible weight that convinces people it is safer not to try. Safer not to speak. Safer not to lead. The silence becomes a legacy in itself. A space where change could have lived, but now only whispers remain. A question worth asking. This isn't about claiming shadowy figures or secret meetings. It's not about assigning blame to the unknown. It is far simpler and far more human than that. It is about asking a question most of us avoid. Why does this keep happening? Why do the men who speak most clearly, who love most deeply, who challenge most boldly, seem to vanish just as their message begins to spread? Why do we accept this as inevitable? Why do we shrug and move on, even when history presents the same pattern over and over, decade after decade? It is not a question meant to incite fear. It is a question meant to provoke awareness, to make us pause, to make us examine what we tolerate, intentionally or unconsciously, when those who try to lift us up are taken from us. History offers examples too numerous to count. From Martin Luther King Jr. to Malcolm X, from Thomas Sankara to the notorious B.I.G., from activists to artists, visionaries to organizers, men who refuse to stay silent and whose absence continues to echo, carrying the torch forward. Maybe the answer isn't to look outward for villains. Maybe the answer isn't to point fingers at systems or conspiracies. Maybe the answer is to look inward. Maybe the responsibility no longer belongs to a single voice, a single figure, a single savior. Maybe it belongs to all of us. Because if history has taught us anything, it is this. Waiting for one man to save everyone has always come at a terrible cost. The men we lost weren't just individuals. They were beacons. They were catalysts. They were proof that change was possible, that courage mattered, that resistance could be organized. And while their lives were stolen, their work was not. The real question isn't why they were taken. It isn't who wanted them silenced. It isn't even what history says. The real question is this: are we willing to finish what they started? Are we willing to rise in their place, to carry the torch, to speak the truths they once spoke, to organize, to build, to resist, to act? Because if we do not, if we sit quietly, waiting for someone else, waiting for another leader to appear, then history will continue to repeat itself, and the silence will remain. But if we choose differently, if we dare to believe that we are stronger together than we are alone, then perhaps the echoes of the voices taken too soon will finally become a chorus, and the world may yet move forward. As we close this story, I want to acknowledge the men whose voices were taken far too soon. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, Fred Hampton, Huey P. Newton, Nipsey Hussle, Tupac Shakur, the notorious B.I.G., Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, Thomas Sankara, Mahatma Gandhi, and Yitzhak Rabin. I know there are countless others, men whose lives and contributions may not have reached me, or who I wasn't taught about in my time. These are the men from my time, The ones who shaped my understanding of courage, leadership, and unity. As we close this story, I want to acknowledge the men whose voices were taken far too soon. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, Fred Hampton, Huey P. Newton, Nipsey Hussle, Tupac Shakur, the notorious B.I.G, Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, Thomas Sankara, Mahatma Gandhi, and Yitzhak Rabin. I know there are countless others, men whose lives and contributions may not have reached me, or who I wasn't taught about in my time. These are the men from my time, the ones who shaped my understanding of courage, leadership, and unity. In my opinion, they were silenced so quickly, so suddenly, perhaps to prevent the next one from taking a stand. And yet, even in their absence, they taught us something profound, that no matter our differences, we can stand together, that we can hold different beliefs and still rise as one. But looking around today, it feels almost impossible. The world seems too divided, too fractured, too resistant to real change. So much progress is still needed, and yet it feels as if the forces of opposition are waiting for any moment someone tries to unite us. It's heartbreaking, watching a world that has the potential for so much good, yet seems determined to spiral further downhill. And that's why their legacies matter even more now. Because even in a world that often refuses to learn, even in a world that continues to falter, the courage, the vision, and the unity they stood for still echo. And maybe, just maybe, if we listen closely, those echoes can guide us toward a future worth fighting for. In our next video, we'll explore the women who were also taken from us far too soon, the voices, leaders, and changemakers whose impact continues to resonate even after they were silenced. Their stories deserve to be heard, remembered, and honored, just as much as the men we've shared today. If you made it this far, please take a second and hit the like and follow button. It's greatly appreciated. See you in the next one.